Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the O'Hara News and Editorial on this Wednesday, the 20th of January, 1915. And tonight we have a very special guest, Chris Good, a man who has just recently, I say just recently, I don't know, but has been the target of feminist censorship from our friends at the Huffington Post.
It's 1915.
Yeah, so yeah, and we're all, of course always joined with James as well, and joined by James. I'm sorry, we are here with James as well, and we're going to do some news stories for the first 30 minutes as always, and Chris Good is going to join us with these news stories, and then we're just going to do a music break and go right into business as usual. Chris, how you doing tonight?
Very well, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Chris is always, anytime we get a caller on the show from someone in the UK, it's always very inconvenient for them because it's very early in the morning for them. What time is it there now? Like 3 o'clock or something like that?
It's not too bad. It's 2 a.m.
Oh, 2. Okay, well that's not too bad. But you're going to be with us for the next hour and 45 minutes at least. So, but you said you're all geeked up on caffeine and biscuits, so that's a good thing.
Ready to go.
Again, good. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and go into the news, and then we'll get on with you, Chris. And of course, we're going to ask you to comment as well. James, go ahead. You had one news story that you wanted to start with first, right?
Yes, I did. This is coming out of the National Post Canada. Sex assault conviction erased. New trial ordered because Alberta judge too sensitive to rape culture. This coming from Joseph Bean, and it's dated January 18th. What he's writing about here is the fact that his sexual assault conviction was erased and a new trial ordered because the judge was deemed too sensitive to rape culture in his courtroom. And the trial was in 2013. The name of the man put on trial was Joshua Michael Schmaltz, and Judge Darwin Greaves, according to this, wrongly entered the fray. And this was decided by the Alberta Court of Appeal. He advocated for the prosecution, guided the complainant to favorable interpretation of her testimony, stymied the defense lawyer's efforts to probe inconsistencies. I'm pulling this language directly from the article. According to this, the conduct appeared to have been motivated by the desire to protect the complainant from being questioned about rape myths. So the trial ending with the judge's unfair conviction, and the appeals court ruled on the matter. Now, in steps Elizabeth Sheehy. I think we've all heard that name before. This was the same individual who has advocated that women get off scot-free for killing their husbands.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. The Vice Dean of Research at the University of Ottawa and an expert on women and the law. She wants to see the case appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. Quoting her, clarify both the judicial responsibility and the boundaries of appropriate judicial intervention for the benefit of women who experience sexual assault, so they know they can what they can realistically expect if they are to take on the courageous role of complainant. Yeah. So, according to Professor Sheehy, the case ruins women's credibility.
Right.
Right.
So, I mean, let's go over the basic details here. So, like, the appeal was based on, again, the language of rape culture comes up.
Mm-hmm.
The person that was the plaintiff said that they wanted to question rape culture. Is that correct?
No, the prosecution
The prosecution wanted to.
was essentially being guided by the judge, and the defense was stymied because the judge was vested with the idea
Of
there
rape.
being a rape culture.
I see.
Okay.
So they're using the idea of rape culture being a tool for the prosecution to actually convict somebody.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, we're looking at we're looking at the defendant. His rights were essentially violated because he was not able to ask
question
the
the
types
idea
of
of rape.
questions.
Right.
No, not even that, but to actually ask the types of questions that would need to be asked of the plaintiff in order to have a defense.
In order the right to face your accuser.
Right.
Basically.
Exactly.
The right to say, okay, you say I did this to you.
Right.
But wait a minute, I have this proof that says that I didn't do this to you. Oh, but wait a minute.
Because of rape culture, it would
Because
be
of rape culture,
inappropriate.
you can't ask
bring
that
it up.
question.
Right.
You can't bring this up.
Exactly. That's pretty much what was going on.
Great. Well, that's pretty interesting news.
Right. On more than one instance, the judge was said to have interjected to ask leading questions or to suggest the most favorable interpretation.
Sure. Right.
Okay, before she had a chance to answer she being the plaintiff. He also demonstrated he was not listening to or understanding some of the inconsistencies presented by the defense counsel.
Right.
Right.
Rape culture.
Rape culture. Now, we'll see. We'll see whether or not this goes up to the Court of Appeals.
Right.
Or actually to the Supreme Court, Alberta Supreme Court. We'll see how that works.
Well, I mean, we're talking about here's the thing. When we're talking about this thing called rape culture, we're talking about strictly and entirely an ideology. It's not something based on fact. It is a concept that is almost entirely made up by people who honestly believe that we live in a world where there is a rapist behind every tree, and every man is a potential rapist, and that we live in a culture that espouses rape, where.
No, we're not saying that the guy is innocent or guilty or anything like that. Keep that in mind. What we are saying, however,
that's not the case of point here, especially with the appeal. It doesn't matter.
The case of point in this matter is that the process was not handled in a non-biased manner.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So, this, if it goes to appeal, they may go ahead and say the conviction holds. Or if it goes to the Supreme Court, they may very well say the conviction holds. If so, they're going to be ruling on. It's going to be an extraordinarily important ruling. So remember this. Remember this story here in 5 or 10 years.
Well, I mean, the ruling
is
this ideology? Does this ideology hold weight in court? Can we actually use this as a tool to keep someone from defending themselves from a conviction? And that's basically what the gist of it is, right?
Right.
Which is, well, I mean, of course, you and I think it's crazy.
We'll see.
Yeah.
There might be a whole lot of people moving away from Canada here in about 10 years.
Sure.
Oh,
you can't defend yourself from a rape accusation, because if you dare try to do so,
then you're
you're touting, quote, rape culture.
Right.
Then just defending yourself, just trying to actually just basically, it sounds to me like if you just try to produce evidence in front of a court, then someone could say, a prosecutor could say, hey, you're all about rape culture, so what you're saying is just doesn't hold any weight. Even if you produce proof or want to cross-examine your accuser, heaven forbid you should ever want to do that, then you're guilty, basically.
Right. So what do you think of this, Chris?
Well, I'm only really now reading the link to the article that you sent, but I think what seems obvious to me is that within courts we're seeing that bias is coming in where really we only need to be focusing on the evidence before us and making sure. I'm a very big advocate that of evidence-based, not assumptions, but opinions and conclusions. And obviously, if anything is coming into court that is favourable to either men or women against evidence, if evidence cannot be properly and effectively presented, then that's something that needs to be looked at. But this is the world we live in. We see this in other courts as well, family courts. Now, of course, the rape culture is coming in. So we're very much, there are pressures from society, and that is going to influence everybody in the courtroom. What we need is for the courtroom to be a place where all preconceptions are put aside, and we look at the evidence in an objective manner. And from what I'm reading, that doesn't seem...
Which unfortunately is counter to the feminist claim that logic is in fact a tool of the patriarchy.
Oh, sorry. Counter to that. Oh, you bamboozled me then, I'm afraid.
Well, what I mean to say is that an evidence-based judicial system, like the one you would hope would be put in place, is actually considered a patriarchal construct.
Oh, I haven't really ever come across that, but we would. Is there anything? I don't really like any references to the patriarchy. Really, I think there are huge problems looking back.
Well, there are people in this country who have actually said, here in the U.S., especially when it comes to accusations of sexual assault in college campuses, where we have this thing called the Dear Colleague letter, where men who are going to college have their due process rights completely taken away. People actually said this whole idea of due process is in actuality a patriarchal concept. It is male privilege. Due process is male privilege when you're a man accused of rape. So if you want the right to face your accuser and bring evidence to the court proving your innocence, well, that's just male privilege. But that's for real, Chris. We're not joking around. There are people.
No, I'm seeing that would be the case. Yeah, it raises a lot of questions, really.
Sure, yeah, a lot. Well, important ones. We talk about that a lot here, so we didn't mean to blindside you with questions. We wanted your input. I'm going to go ahead with the next story, James, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go for it.
The sperm is property story. Do you want to do that? We'll both do that together.
Yeah.
Okay. This is from Canadian Lawyers Mag. An interesting story about sperm and whether or not it's property. And this is the article is titled "Sperm is Property: Rules British Columbia Appeal Court." Interesting story. Written by Shannon Carey. I'm assuming that's a woman, might be a man, I don't know. But it came to us on Wednesday, the 14th, which would be last week. The British Columbia Court of Appeal has determined that this is a very short article, so I'm just going to read it in its entirety. But it's a legalese article, so it'll give us some brain picking material here. The British Columbia Court of Appeal has determined that human sperm is, quote, property under the terms of a provincial statute that regulates the storage of goods. The court ruled against the University of British Columbia and found it cannot rely on an exclusion clause it included in an agreement with a number of sperm donors. The decision, Lamb versus University of British Columbia, is the latest legal chapter in a long-running class action lawsuit against the university alleging negligence and breach of contract over a malfunction at a freezer in its andrology laboratory. About 400 men who had been diagnosed with cancer
Oh no,
stored their
Robert,
sperm
we're
in an
starting to lose you,
ultra-cold
man.
freezer operated by the university. Really? Am I still here? Still
Yeah,
here,
you're
James?
still here. You're still here. Just
Hello?
I
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and keep on going. Where did you lose me? About 400 men who had been diagnosed with cancer. Is that where you lost me?
yes.
Okay. About 400 men who had been diagnosed with cancer stored their sperm in an ultra-cold freezer operated by the university and were required to pay annual fees. In 2002, it was discovered that the freezer had suffered a power interruption, which either damaged or destroyed the stored sperm. The plaintiffs, represented by lawyer Arthur Grant, argued that a provision of the Warehouse Recipient Act applied. The statute does not permit a quote, warehouser to insert any term of condition that restricts its obligation to exercise, quote, care and diligence in regard to the goods. The definition of goods under the statute includes all property other than things in action, money, and land. UBC argued, quote, from a historical and contextual analysis that, the property under the provincial statute could only refer to goods that could be traded commercially since, this is in parentheses, since 2004, there has been a prohibition in Canada on commercial trade of human sperm under the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. Interesting. The majority decision stressed that defining human sperm as property may bring with it, quote, a host of other legal rights and issues, unquote, which need not be decided on the facts in this proceeding. Quote, this case considers whether Mr. Lamb, a cancer patient, has ownership of the sperm he produced, such that he can contract for its storage to enable his personal use of the sperm at a later date, unquote, wrote Bennett on behalf of Justice David Frankel in the majority. Justice Edward Cason wrote a concurring judgment. The Court of Appeal concluded that each of the donors had, quote, ample rights in relation to the ownership of his own specimen. Okay. So basically what happened was these guys they stored their sperm. They were cancer patients. And they put their sperm in this University of British Columbia. And there was a problem with the storage where the sperm were destroyed or damaged or whatever. Otherwise, it's done. So they sued.
And it looks like sperm is now being ruled as property, right?
Right, yeah. Well, this is very interesting, because that means that, and we've seen this before. Here in the U.S., where women have actually gone to sperm banks where their husbands have stored their sperm for whatever reason, and have actually obtained their sperms and gotten themselves pregnant with this sperm. And now they're pregnant. They basically jacked this sperm. They stole it. And now these guys are on the hook, even though they didn't want to become parents. But
for a bunch of child support.
Yeah,
well, this is understand this. This should be interesting in things like divorce court. The reason I say that is because, in this case, in British Columbia, now that it is being ruled as property, and there's precedent set, will 50% of the sperm stored now revert to community property?
Yeah, exactly. That's just what it comes down to. No, this is a serious question. We laugh, but this is a very serious question here.
Yeah. So the question, the question is whether or not the the guy should be removing his deposit from the bank and having it transferred to a hidden account at another sperm bank. I know that sounds silly, but this is.
Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
and then
we
we have
really
this
do need to
other
kind
bank.
of think of it in this way on a legal basis. Um, this would conceivably be the only way to protect yourself from having half your sperm taken in the case of divorce as community property, and then um,
Well, also,
and
I
then
mean,
used
like, is your
against you.
sperm property like while it's still in your testes or in the vas or in the prostate gland? I mean, this actually legally opens up the case to where, hey, listen, this is my sperm, my property. If someone used it for purposes other than what I wanted them to use it for, then why should I be liable for the outcome? I mean, if you take this question to the extreme,
Right.
it
I mean,
could
there's
open
all
up
kinds of.
it could possibly open up the idea for reproductive rights for men, which scares the crap out of a
Well,
great many people.
it's going to put the idea on the table, and that is where it needs
Of
to
course.
start because we just don't see enough of that being spoken about. Um, for good or ill, changes in the law of this nature are going to bring these questions to the forefront of people's consciousness. That's where it needs to be. It needs to be thought about. So we'll see what happens as a result of this particular ruling and find out whether or not, some inventive divorce lawyers use it in court, find out whether or not some guys out there all of a sudden decide to start not donating into a account that their wife would know about, things of that nature. We'll see.
Right. It's an interesting case. The idea that your sperm is your own property is something that really introduces a real. It kind of throws some sand. It kind of throws a wrench into the gears of a lot of people's logic when it comes to men's reproductive rights.
Well,
So
and
I'm
it's a
interested to
double
see
edged it's a
what
double edged sword in some ways, and
sure it
that's
is.
primarily where I'm looking at it from. Is I'm looking at both of the edges, so to speak. Okay, so what do you think, Chris?
I think again I'm reading through, but I was very shocked to hear about those incidences of men donating their sperm and then it being obtained by their ex partners, I guess.
Yeah, this actually happened in a case in Pennsylvania where, well, it wasn't. There was actually. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interject, but there was a really
No, it's good.
important case in Pennsylvania that happened a couple of years ago. And we covered it on this radio show, where a woman who had been divorced from her husband for several years, they had both agreed to fertilize some embryos and
Right.
have them frozen before she underwent cancer treatment. And then during the course of her cancer treatment, the marriage went on the rocks and they got divorced and whatnot. But these embryos still were there. He did not consent to reproduce with her. He actually had something put in a clause that actually said that he somewhere in the contract with the storage facility that had these embryos, he said that they would be they actually said they would be destroyed after I think a year or two if they hadn't been used. The storage facility actually kept them for a number of years, 4 years, and she was actually able to go and get these embryos, these frozen embryos, and have them because the cancer treatment left her completely unable to have children, infertile. She was in her early 40s at the time. She was actually to get these embryos and against his will had them inserted into a surrogate mother, and she actually reproduced with him against his will. And there are other ample cases where women go and they forge signatures to get their ex's frozen sperm or whatever and get pregnant by them and actually get child support. Now, in this case in Pennsylvania, the court said, well, she's not asking for child support, so we'll let the legislature take care of that problem if it comes about, which, of course, we all know it will come about.
Yeah,
as soon as the first medical bill comes in for the kid. So it was a huge, just a huge slap in the face for the idea of men actually having any kind of reproductive agency at all. But this is really interesting. This idea that sperm is actually your own property, and that you should have control. If you can sue for damages if the property is damaged, why are you liable for what happens if it's actually stolen from you?
Of course. Yeah.
And even if it's stolen from a storage facility, or to take the argument to the extreme, if you have sex with somebody and you don't consent to be a parent, should you be liable for child support in this case? If your quote property is not being used. Yeah, right. Does it stop becoming your property once it goes out of your penis? Whether it goes into a storage facility or into a woman's body? That's an interesting question. And this court case rises. I think it I don't know. That's my take on this. It brings up some interesting questions that need to be talked about. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I would like to hear your opinion on that.
No, well, I really come down to, again, I try and just stay quite black and white on these things, but obviously it comes down to what you consent to, what you contract to, and I would be curious to know if there are any instances of men being able to take the embryos, find a surrogate mother, and how that would play out, and it's a huge issue. But as far as I'm concerned, if you are putting your trust in an institution or anything, and stating your aims, then that has to be honoured. That's basic respect. But this is not something
these guys actually, they actually paid money to do this. In this case,
they paid an annual fee, didn't they? And yes, yeah, remarkable.
Interesting.
All right, folks. We're going to go ahead and take a short break at this time. I'm going to go ahead and take us to a music break, and we will be right back, okay?
And we're back with James Huff and Chris Good. And we did have one more news story that we wanted to talk about. We had some technical problems we wanted to clear up before we continued. But we did have one more news story we wanted to clear up before we continued with our guest. This story is, again, by one of my most favorite, probably my most favorite columnists in the whole world, who I definitely want to try to get on the show sometime in the next few weeks. I hope she agrees. Ashley Shao from the Washington Examiner. Again, another very short story from her, entitled "Utah State Representative Wants to Remove Proof from Consent Law." Utah State Representative Angela Romero has introduced a bill that would remove from law the requirement that accusers prove they did not consent to sexual activities. HB 74 seeks to change the definition of consent under Utah's sexual offense law, removing the requirement that accusers prove they did not consent, quote, when the defendant knows the victim is unconscious, unaware the act is occurring, or physically unable to resist. At first glance, removing the need for proof may seem fine, as the accuser is supposedly unable to consent. But then, how were they made aware of the alleged attack? The accuser's testimony would then be evidence. If an accuser knows or believes they were attacked while unable to consent, they should already have some proof the attack occurred. Removing the need for any such proof does nothing but open the door to baseless accusations. If the reason for changing the law is to shift the burden of proof to the accused, this turns the legal system upside down, forcing people to prove their innocence in court. Remember, not everyone accused of a crime is a criminal. Moreover, the new definition would remove the consent requirement, quote, when the defendant knows, unquote, the alleged victim is incapacitated. But how does one prove such knowledge without also proving the accuser didn't consent? At best, this law does absolutely nothing. At worst, it opens the door for more unchallengeable and false accusations. Representative Romero did not respond to Washington Examiner's inquiry. Ashley Shao is just really coming out in force in recent months. She is one of my favorite recent red pill recipients, I think. Definitely want to get her on the show sometime. She's a young commentator for the Washington Examiner. I think she's been with him for no more than 2 years now, but she is just really tearing up this whole rape culture hysteria in higher education, and she has definitely got her ear to the tracks as far as what's going on with this erosion of due process and the burden of proof concept in our judicial system. And again, this is another one of her short articles that she seems to be writing every day. She's just brilliant. And this particular article about doing away with the idea that this proof of consent thing, this is a trick. This idea that, why should an accuser have to prove something if they were, quote, unconscious or incapacitated? Well, hold on a second. First of all, you have to prove you're incapacitated. Second of all, how can this person defend themselves from such an accusation if the burden of proof falls on them? They can't. And this is the big problem. And it truly does turn our entire justice system on its head. But this is the goal that we see, that I see, and I'm sure that Ms. Shao sees with these feminist ideologues when it comes to accusations of sexual assault. Do away with due process, reverse the onus of the burden of proof from the alleged victim to the accused, which is completely backwards, and make it to where basically an accusation is proof of guilt. And this is such an incredibly dangerous thing. And we think the thing is, when it comes to accusations of sexual assault, people seem to be all on the bandwagon about it. At least superficially they do. Until recently, I would certainly hope. I've seen many more people like Michelle questioning this. But people think that this is going to just stop with sexual assault cases. It's not going to. Due process is a line in the sand when it comes to the power of the state and the individual. Once you start eroding that, it's all over. They can make a case out of anything. It's not going to stop with sexual assault. It's not going to stop with anything. It's going to basically mean that any kind of accusation that not just one individual brings up against another, but any accusation that the state may bring up against any individual, when you reverse the onus, when you reverse the burden of proof from the accuser to the accused, you have completely eroded the boundary of the power of the state over the individual. And that's what due process is all about. And when I see things like this, that's what I think about. I don't think about. It doesn't stop with sexual assault allegations with me. It goes on to a great many other things. It's a statist strategy, I think. But it's so convenient for this whole thing to start with accusations of sexual assault, because who doesn't want to see a rapist go to jail? It's so easy to get people all worked up in hysterics over a rape accusation.
Easy enough to kill them in the street.
Absolutely, I was about to say lynching. I mean,
without any kind of
trial,
right,
with no
with
trial,
no trial, right?
Yeah, and I think I believe that you can call me a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but I believe that there are many people who are using this feature of human nature in a cynical way to erode the power of the individual over the state. That's my take on this. Gentlemen, give me yours.
I don't think I can add much more to that.
Well, yeah, I'll refrain from commenting more, but I would certainly like to read more into this. It's interesting, and it suddenly looks like it's taking a particular direction, which should get some attention, really. Yeah.
Well, without a doubt, and even even with the whole sexual grievance industry, and it is an industry, it's a multinational, multi-billion-dollar industry, where you have advocacy agencies collecting millions of dollars just from taxpayers alone. That in and of itself is enough to kick this whole erosion of due process off the curb. But it's scary. It opens up the possibility for so much more. And you can never underestimate the powers that be, and they're, again, you can call me a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist all you want, but history is proof that once you start eroding due process, totalitarian states not far behind. It's just the way it is. That's my take on this.
Right, because if it can apply to something as simple as rape, it can apply to other things as well. I mean, this is right, and really.
Well, we already have domestic violence.
It'll end up applying to everybody.
Domestic violence and
it'll end up applying to everybody across the board eventually.
Who's ever been accused of any crime, and it's not just when one individual accuses another individual. It will apply to when the state accuses you of doing something wrong. Tax evasion.
Right.
Prove you didn't pay your taxes, or else you go to jail. Wait a minute, I didn't. I lost my W-2 form. I moved. even if you did pay your taxes, well, guess what? You still go to jail, and you got to pay up until you get out. I don't think that's all that absurd to think that it's going to move to that. So
It's already happening with child support.
yeah, basically, yeah. Oh, prove this isn't your kid. Wait a minute, you can't get a paternity test. No, illegal. You already signed the birth certificate.
Yep.
For the dad, and now of course, in France, and I think increasingly in England, they're pushing towards actually doing paternity tests illegal. So it's amazing how these things start with gender relations and accusations between men and women, and how our society's natural propensity to protect the female sex, I think, is being used in a cynical manner to do away with basic protections for the individual. Again, this sounds like, for many people, this sounds like a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theory, but I think there's something going on there. Maybe to you, Chris, this might sound extreme, but
No.
I think no. Okay, yeah, it's just because reading your stuff. We talk about this kind of thing a lot at AVFM, and a lot of men's rights activists talk about this a lot. This usage of a man's natural desire to protect women being used in a cynical manner in order to take rights away from men, and in order for the state to get more control.
Yeah, no, I've been reading a lot of what's on A Voice for Men. Yeah, I think there are elements of truth to all of these things, and sometimes ideas can be taken to an extreme and take them away from the plausible argument and the plausible concern, and that's. But yeah, I do agree. This addresses a lot of what Warren Farrell has written in one of my favorite books. Does feminism discriminate against men? And yeah, it's addressed in that. So it's a subject with many layers, isn't it?
Sure.
Dominoes, we might call it.
Yeah. Let's we talk about the news a lot, and we definitely want to get some callers in here. So, James, I'm wondering if we could do another quick music break. We'll announce the phone number. The
Actually,
number
let's
is 214.
let's announce the phone number on the hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. For now, I'm very interested to hear about what Chris has gone through. In his
Sure,
time
absolutely.
recently.
Let's go ahead. Yeah. It's 9:45 right now. So let's go ahead and start with your interview, Chris.
Okay.
Yeah. First of all, we're actually very informal here. Things happen and whatnot. But let's. I want to welcome you to our show. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
To be interviewed. Great. Again,
Thank
thanks
you for
for
having
staying
me.
up so late. Sure. Now you started. When did you start? Here's the overview of your story, as we understand it. You wrote several articles for the Huffington Post, and the Huffington Post isn't like a lot of other news outlets. It's kind of like a collective of blogs. Basically,
Yes.
it's people write posts, and it's very inclusive for the most part. But you started writing articles because you were a very competent writer, and they were attracted to you, and your articles became popular. And then you kind of got under the skin of a certain type of Huffington Post writer or the editors, namely the feminists, because you openly started criticizing feminist ideology in your writing. Is that basically what happened?
Yes. Well,
and we'll go in chronological order here. We'll try to so we can explain to our audience what happened to you.
Yeah. So tell the story. Yeah. Well, okay. So I decided at the end of last year to go back to freelance writing, and
that's when it started last year, right?
Yes, about October, November. And
how were you invited to write for the Huffington Post? Did they call you up? Did they email you and say write for us, or how does that work?
No, I was just looking for exposure initially,
Mhm.
and the Huffington Post. I realised that I was approaching everybody to be honest, and so magazines I'd written for in the past, just on men's interests and health, lifestyle issues, such as Ask Men, which I believe is more popular over there,
Sure.
as online men's interest. So I was going back to old connections. I was approaching the Guardian in the UK, and then the Huffington Post came up, and I felt that might just be a good place to experiment with some different subjects and write more freely and see what took off. So I pitched an article to them, and they accepted me as one of their bloggers. So from that point,
Right.
it was actually in their introduction email. They told me I wouldn't have to pitch anymore, that I was just welcome to submit my next blog post, my next article to them.
Mhm.
And they actually made a point in the email, and I have the email, that they were really after controversial pieces and things that would spark up debates. They wanted to see writers commenting to each other and responding. So I submitted a few pieces on relationships and parenthood. And then something got under my skin regarding feminism. I got to that point. It was the He for She campaign. And
Oh.
I I really wasn't setting myself up as somebody that wanted to jump wholeheartedly into anti-feminism or gender equality debates, but it was just the subject of my next article or piece. So after pitching it to several other publications, the original article I wanted to write was about how He for She was taking the wrong approach regarding gender equality, and how the correct way to look at it would be to looking to equalise men's and women's rights. That the Guardian, despite a very feminist voice, wouldn't publish the piece. Neither would other mainstream media, and to my surprise, the Huffington Post just put it through. They didn't question it. And so before I knew it, my first gender equality article, titled "Why Feminism Needs to End, It's Time to Work Towards Equality," it just blipped up, and and they printed it. And then it took off.
So, but it didn't start as you just sort of started writing about men and women and relationships and men's health issues. But this particular issue with the he for she thing, you said, wait a minute, I want to write how I feel about feminism and this ideology, and in
Yes.
particular this he for she campaign, and they just decided to go ahead and go with it. What this is interesting about the Huffington Post. This is something I don't understand. I think a lot of people don't understand. How does their editorialship work? I mean, it seems like a really interesting organization that isn't really. I
Yeah.
mean, it seems like what is it? Because like, is there do they have an editorial board? Do they actually have? Or is it kind of like they have a bunch of moderators like men's rights, like Reddit or something like that? Or
Yeah.
how do things get published on the Huffington Post? If you can give some insight
Well, they
on how
have
that
their
works.
from what I know anyway, they have their staff writers. So that would consist of
Right.
the editors for each section. It's very much run like any other publication.
Right.
But what they do is while they have base articles which are written by their paid staff of the Huffington, they also invite anybody that they approve to offer their blogs, and that's what gives them a broader readership and many the probably the flesh on their website. That they take care of the bones, they put the opportunity there, and they promote it as a way for writers to start up and gain initial exposure. So they rely very heavily on their bloggers, but they also within their various sections have their own staff writers. So I guess it's quite similar to The Guardian, which is very much the same. Actually, they invite lots of bloggers and other more casual writers, but they have their staff approving what's brought in.
Right. It just seems like a bit looser than a lot of other publications, whether they be online or in print or both. I mean, when people
Yeah,
talk about the Huffington Post, they think it's like a collection of bloggers.
it is for the
But
most
they do
part.
have
Yeah.
right. But they do have a structure. They do like have an editorial structure where people decide what gets published and what does not. But your articles became targeted. Along with the first one being the one that you just mentioned. How did this play out? Did someone say something to you, or was it just taken down all of a sudden, or what?
Well,
How did the censorship? Because you basically ultimately all these things were taken down. And how many articles did you write that were critical of feminism? And how did things start? And how did they play out? And how did they end? I'll just go ahead and let
okay.
you describe that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, of everything that I posted on Huffington, the feminist article, that first one, really took off, and I was introduced to Dean Esme commented on the article and contacted me on Twitter, and
So it took off. It got a lot of readers. First of all, it took off. It became popular. That's how it all started, right?
yeah, and the comment thread also was heavily populated by men's rights activists, people just commenting that it was a refreshing perspective that they hadn't considered. So we're talking there about the people that hadn't really considered that men and women can face oppression in the way that feminism is creating new gender roles, new acceptable gender roles in our society, which is what that first article addressed, that women are praised for going out and working, and men are patted on the head for staying at home, and it's redefining the shape of our society. And a point that I made in that article was that one of the first points I made in the article was the media censorship, how I couldn't get it published anywhere, despite there being a permitted feminist voice in most publications. So it was a surprise to myself and many of the readers and commenters that the Huffington allowed it to happen. But what was also quite great was that feminists were expressing anger and disapproval on Twitter and in the comment threads. But I was doing my best to have conversations with them one-on-one and just try to dialogue and converse with them on the issue. And that was going really quite well. And so what ended up happening was that as a result of my conversations with mainly the feminists, their first objection was you'll be very aware of this argument, that I had misunderstood the idea of feminism, and that feminism was is actually the fight for equality. And so this being the most common accusation and objection to that article, that I decided that is what I should address in the second article, which is the plainly stated title, Why Feminism is Not the Fight for Equality. So in that, I was trying to create a bit of a discussion and a continued conversation, and respond to the feminist objection to the articles. So that conversation continued to my third article, in which I tackled a more specific subject, which was domestic abuse and violence, and how men are not the only perpetrators, but are actually more often than not the victims, which was the last article for the Huffington Post. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the philosophical journey here. You've originally started writing not thinking that you were going to be an ideological warrior. You just started writing things about gender relations, and then you wrote this piece about the He for She campaign.
Yes.
And then the reaction, it became popular, and became popular, and then in response to this popularity in the comment section and people talking about it, and your conversation with feminists, you decided at that point to write another article saying, "Wait a minute, these people are ideologues. This is not how we should talk about. This is not how we should approach gender equality, because these people are." Did you at some point did you come to the conclusion that feminists were not about gender equality?
Oh yes.
Or this ideology? Okay,
Yes.
when did that happen?
Well, it happened before I wrote the first article, but obviously encountering, obviously watching Emma Watson's speech for the UN, I realized there was a significant bias, and the way that I first really encountered feminism was I dated a couple of feminists, and needless to say, I didn't get second dates because I couldn't help but argue my disapproval with them. Yes. So I mean, but for the second article, I really had this question over me that feminists believe that, or some feminists anyway, believe that. No, sorry, they all do. That feminism is the fight for equality, and yet any fight for equality needs to address the needs of both genders. It's quite plain to see that feminism only concerns itself with the needs of women and the prejudice that women face. Now, I am the first. Well, I'm not the first person to say, but I very eagerly say that, of course, women still face areas of prejudice, that there are ways that men can, or well, anyone can be sexist toward women, but that doesn't take away from the fact that men can be the victims of sexism. And so if we look at the idea of what a fight for equality would look like, as I say at the end of my first article, the title would not imply that one gender should fight only for the rights of the other, and nor would its title claim. Well, if we look at he for she, we see that the entire placement of the words in that title are saying that men should fight for women, and the subtext of that is that women are victimized and men should start to do something about that. And of course, when you see situations like family courts and men being estranged from their children, which then opens up the whole subject of parent alienation, which is very closely following divorce and full custody by the mother. This is something that, if it was reversed, feminism would tackle this. Same with domestic violence. If it were true that, say, that the latest statistic that's chucked around the UK at least is that 60% of women, the ratios in terms of who are the victims of domestic violence are 60% women and 40% men. Now, let us just assume that that was flipped and that it was 60% men which were being dealt with and 40% women. We can imagine the feminist uproar that 40% of women are not listened to. So what is the fight for equality?
Right.
It has to acknowledge all prejudice and all sexism, which is clearly not happening. If we feminism, if you Google feminism and look at the first few sites, they are all concerned with women's issues. If you have a look at their video, they're on about empowering women, they're on about the victimization of women. And if we're comparing something like catcalling, which gains so much attention from feminism, surely that fight for equality should also be raising the issue of men being beaten or divorce courts favouring the mother for custody. That is what the fight for equality would look like, and that is not how we can view feminism in any sense.
So you wrote, you actually crossed the line. I would think when you actually wrote an article about domestic violence and your own experience with intimate partner abuse. This
Yeah.
is something that we, of course, here in the men's rights movement, that's heresy when you question the feminist narrative about that. And it seems to me that you came across this, that you were you expect, was this the point when you really saw the backlash when you actually wrote about your experiences of intimate partner abuse? Well, I mean, obviously you're engaging in heated arguments with feminists before this, but
Yeah.
when you actually start talking about your own experiences with domestic abuse, is this when you really, really saw the real opposition, when it was like, you absolutely must not talk about this? Was that your experience?
Um, to a degree, I think
Okay.
what's quite significant is that
I guess the question I'm asking, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stop you, but the question I'm
yeah.
asking is, like, we've seen so oftentimes that it is the issue of domestic violence that is the one issue that feminists defend so staunchly as being the one that they feel they must
Um,
have dominance over the entire narrative.
mm.
Did you experience this when you wrote about your experiences with domestic violence?
Yeah. Well, with the previous things I was raising, they're all trying to define feminism or equality. That these are
Right.
high up in the sky, aren't they? And
Mm-hmm.
so when we're speaking about a specified issue such as domestic violence, yes, I think that is when the hypocrisy of the feminists that were objecting became much more evident. So, for example, yes, I was told that. Just imagine this being said to a woman. I was yeah, I was hit with the fact of how many women are killed through domestic violence. I was told that I
Right.
myself should have left the relationship. I was told that I should have been
Right.
strong enough for it not to be an issue. And so all of these things, that they are victim blaming, and
Yeah, the hypocrisy came out, in other
y-
words.
yeah, and I think I think that's when you can look at a movement and really question what are the principles by which these people are trying to live, and what principles are guiding what they're saying. Because if 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 any of us, which I know I know the three of us would say that if we see anybody in a position where they cannot fight back, where they are powerless to fight back, and yet they are being assaulted in any way, then that is wrong. That's what we would call crime, and that needs to be addressed. It is quite shocking then that feminists who would say don't blame the victim would come to me and say, you had all the power you need, you should have left, it should have been within your control, you are not a victim. And yes, the hypocrisy came out, and of course something happened with that article, because that was the point where they all disappeared. That was the final straw, where a particular feminist, and I forget her name, contacted Huffington, it would appear, and she said on Twitter that they'll all be gone by the end of the day, and that was the case. Dean Esme's articles were pulled at the same time.
When was this?
This was, well, I think end of November.
Okay. So in the end of November, and then it was they actually announced this. They said, "Okay, you've crossed the line. You've committed the great heresy. You questioned our narrative of domestic violence. So all of your stuff is getting taken off. Even
Oh,
though we may have agreed with you at some points, everything that you've ever written on Huffington Post is getting taken off. And by the way, Dean Esme's stuff is getting taken off too. And
well,
this was the and was this person a staffer at the Huffington Post or?"
no. See, the real shocking thing here is that I wasn't informed that my articles were being taken
Of
down.
course not. Of course not. Yes.
I was speaking with Dean on Dean Esme on Facebook, and for some reason I mentioned what his next article might be. I think it was, and he informed me that he wasn't writing for them anymore, and he told me that they were taken down. And then, just out of curiosity, I went onto my own to see what the case was, and yes, no load up or anything. All of my articles have been removed as well, and apparently this was due to some sort of outrage on Twitter, which I didn't get to see. But what I understand is that, yeah, we were all removed at the same time, which was very shocking. I emailed Huffington and asked them what the deal was. They never responded to two emails, and I know a few other people that have emailed them to question why that was the case, and there's just been nothing back, which is a real shame because one, you would have to question that if the Huffington Post, their welcoming email is inviting controversy and debate and interesting subjects, why is this, which is fact-based and based on real statistics, why is this not welcome on their pages? It doesn't bode well, does it, really?
Sure, and this is really well, this is a big deal. I mean, we're talking about blatant censorship here, where
Yes.
you have people presenting rational arguments that are evidence based, that they were invited to present, and then when it doesn't, obviously there was a narrative that it did not fit into, and people objected to it, and they said, okay, we're just not going to put this up here on the Huffington Post, even though we invited these people to come talk about this. They didn't agree with us in the end, so all their stuff is going to go. And
Yeah.
you never, the thing that baffles me every single time, and I'm being conversational here instead of being inquisitive, the thing that baffles me every single time is that there's this pattern where you don't, if you're the one questioning this or talking or having a counter argument, you're left in the dark as to what's happening to your material, whether or not it's still on the site or not. No one tells you that they're taking the stuff off. There's this huge accusation and argument going on behind your back that you're not made aware of. And before you know it, all your stuff is gone and your name is mud, and you're just kind of left out in the lurch. And you were kind of an up and comer because you had these articles that people talked about, but because they were talked about and you presented these arguments that were provocative and that people actually wanted to discuss, that made you a target. And but still, we don't know what. And you said this yourself. Were these people were they editors? Were they actual executives? Were they? Who are the people actually making these decisions to make these things happen? We don't know, do we? Do you know?
No, I've had no communication with them since, and that's not for
right.
I've tried, but it does seem really odd because after the first article, there was such a great response, and more than any feminist objection on the comment threads was celebration and praise for Huffington Post for being one of the few, if you call it mainstream, or easily accessible media outlets to actually offer this voice and this side of the argument. They only received praise. They only received, from the majority, they received extremely high page views and shares. And so it could only have been good for them in that sense. And so why is it that after apparently and what must have been a threatening or ultimatum email came from whichever feminist this was that objected to it and said she had the power to stop this, why is it that happened? It's not that they didn't even sort of say, carry on blogging for us, Chris, but please leave that subject alone. They wiped it from existence. They completely erased it.
As if you never existed. Just
yes,
bam, must be erased.
Yeah, and more than that, I feel for the people that took time to comment on the article and invested in that. Articles, and invested in those, gave their own stories, engaged in debate. For the most part, it was quite a civil conversation. And why is it that in the media we are subject to so much outrageous feminist accusations? I really hate the argument, the "as we know" argument, which I want to write about soon. That it's feminist articles will pass off so many comments as fact. So as we know, well, for example, so I walked into the office wearing high heels, which, as we know, are a tool of the patriarchy to sexually objectify women. Now, this "as we know" comment is passed off as fact that requires no more evidence or information, and it becomes somehow a cultural belief or idea that's out there that women start quoting in the office. And I think that's so damaging. And where is the responsibility of our media to allow a counter voice? It should be there.
Let's before we get. I do hope that callers are considering calling in. But before we get to callers, as long as we were talking about the issue of domestic violence, that this was the turning point where you, quote, jumped the shark, so to speak. That's an old show business term we use here in the U.S. With the feminists. If you don't mind talking about your experiences with domestic violence here, you're certainly free to do so, and it's certainly something worth talking about if you're comfortable talking about it, of course. And I don't want to.
Sure.
And I'd like to spend, if it's okay with you, just spend a few moments, well, more than a few moments, maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so, talking about your experiences with domestic violence, because I think that anytime a man gets a chance to do so in a public venue such as we have here, it's healthy to do so. Tell us what you wrote about with your experiences of domestic violence, or just in your own words, what happened in your experiences, what prompted you to write about it, and how did this unfold? If you could just in your own words explain or just describe your experiences with intimate partner violence with your ex-girlfriend.
Yeah, not a problem. Well, of course, domestic violence or
I wish we had Aaron Pizzi here right now, but we don't.
Oh, I know.
James.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm going to try to channel her now, but please just go ahead. If you could just explain maybe the start of the relationship and how it unfolded and what you gathered from it.
Sure. Well, I was, my experience of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, whatever you may call it, it's certainly not the most extreme. But just a side note, a female that I was speaking to told me that she went to a domestic abuse support group, and she felt that her experience wasn't as extreme as others, or what you may view on TV adverts and things, which it's actually on one of the first domestic violence websites that you'll find that things are often not as extreme, but they as depicted on adverts. But it is domestic violence, and so it is a legitimate problem. Now that's addressing women. So of course, all women that experience that in any sense, they are eligible for the support and the understanding, and that should be the case. So regarding my experience of domestic violence, I will say that there were no moments for myself, but I know of other men that have experienced really extreme examples of it, where I was cowering in the corner and believing I couldn't defend myself. In fact, one of the biggest things about female to male domestic violence, I believe, is the fact that as powerful as we may be physically, we are not powerful in that sense to fight back, and that is exactly what we are cowering from. So my example that I gave in the article was one time when my ex-girlfriend now, we were having a disagreement in the kitchen. It escalated to the point of raised voices, and in just that moment, I suddenly found my nose bleeding because I'd just been punched in the face. Now, that, oddly and bizarrely, I'm the one that taught her how to punch, just in case she ever needed to defend herself. But so I found myself punched in the face, and I left. And I ended up walking in the street. I went to the shop. My nose was bloody. And the point I make in my article is that some people stopped me and asked if I was okay. My t-shirt was stained. It was quite a significant bleed. I'd taken a good smack. Now, one is that I didn't admit to it being my girlfriend, and that's another thing I've faced in some comment threads, that I should have said that it was my girlfriend. I should have told people about this. And of course, we know many victims don't, do they, male or female? And there are many reasons for that. But so, yes, I was powerless in that sense. I was told I should have told the police. I lied and said it was a bunch of guys that hit me. On the flip side of it, my girlfriend was still at home, and our housemate returned home to find her crying and blood on the floor. And he insisted on phoning the police until he realized that she was the one that had punched me, that the blood had come from my nose as a result of her fist. And that is the moment where he decided that intervention from the police wasn't necessary. So just from that alone, we can see that that there is not this expectation to involve the law or consequence as a for the violence
when
of
there's
women.
a female perpetrator, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, that is not the first time that she had hit me. That was probably the time when, post punch tutoring, that she had so effectively hit me. But there were many other times when in a disagreement she'd clock me one with a slap or a wallop. Now, there really isn't anything that I could choose to do in that situation. Like many men, yes, I had the power in each one of those moments to fight back physically. But of course, that is not acceptable.
You did. In actuality, that power is taken away from you, because if you had even done anything at all, the outcome would have. You may not even be talking with us right now. You might be in jail right now, as a matter of fact, if you had done so.
Well, as you bring that up, one of my statements in the article also was that should this happen publicly, what would be the consequence to that? Would somebody tell her to stop? And there were two incidences where that I referred to in the article. One was when we were still together, and she lost her head again and smacked me twice in the face. Now, I didn't punch back, but I did push her away. It was just a defensive motion, but a girl on high heels toppled. And so the people that saw her hitting me and did nothing, but she fell to the floor. And despite their lack of intervention, there was a lack of intervention when she was assaulting me, her falling backward, me evidently now looking like the perpetrator of violence. It was me that was wrestled to the wall and ordered to wait for the police. So, I mean, just in that one instance, there's such, where was the intervention when I was being assaulted? And another one I referred to in the article, which you can now read on Thought Catalog, by the way, was when, after we broke up, she saw me in that same pub garden, actually, and threw my own drink over me after yelling a bit, and then put a cigarette out on my chest. Now, she stomped away, and she went to the bar. It was this victorious female moment for her, and I stood there. No one asked me if I was okay. All people did was sort of laugh at the drama and
of course, always
enjoy. Yeah, and of course it doesn't. It's not rocket science to know that had that been flipped around, had I thrown her drink over her and put my cigarette out on her skin, I wouldn't have come out of that, whether I was arrested or not. I would have come out of that very bruised after an assault from all of the other hero guys. And so is this, but this is not uncommon. This is something we see on our TV screens every day. It is standard, yes. Yeah. Women ending a fight with a slap is a Hollywood moment. It's in all films, and the guy takes it.
Yeah, when you say a fight, it's just a simple argument, not necessarily a physical altercation or anything where somebody does something wrong or damaging. Just a woman ends up assaulting somebody unprovoked, and she becomes even a heroine in some cases.
Exactly. A celebrated strong woman who is owning the moment. Yet she showed him, you know. And what it really comes down to is that we can all have squabbles. Couples are bound to have arguments. There are bound to be raised voices. There is a point, though, where somebody may choose to take that escalation past raised voices and into a physical assault. I would say if let's leave statistics out of this, but just let's refer to our own human experience. Have we seen more female to male violence in our lives? I would argue, most likely, that most of us have seen more women assault men or take that level, escalate it just that little bit more. And in that instance, the man has only a few choices. One is to do nothing. The other is to fight back. And we all know that the consequences to that, and that is powerlessness. And it is one that feminism allows. It is one that the fight for equality, if you're going to call feminism that, somehow allows and accepts that imbalance of power. And of course, we should be looking at it as violence. It's simply crime. It's simply violence. Let's take gender out of it. If we see somebody hitting or shoving or throwing plates at anyone else, that is taking the escalation too far.
It's interesting to know, and I do want to take calls really soon, but something I like to point out often, that what you just described, where if a woman is the perpetrator, of course the male victim is never taken seriously, and whenever the male's perpetrator, the male victim, is held to the highest degree of accountability. That's something that did not start with feminism. That is something that is ancient in actuality, and it's one of those things that men are conditioned to kind of fall into. And again, I like to use the word cynicism, that this is one of these features of humanity that's used in a cynical way by feminists to do tremendous harm. But it's something that I think that can't be pointed out enough. That so many of these problems are simply things that have been around for long before feminism. That feminism is just using in a cynical way to do a lot of damage. Just something I wanted to point out before we started.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Callers. I mean, what? So you agree with that? Those are your thoughts as well. I would suppose.
Yeah. I mean, that imbalance you're saying is not just down to feminism trying to achieve that. No, I would say that the issue there is that if feminism is apparently the fight for equality, then where is it addressing this issue? It's allowing it to continue where it has fought so many other situations of sexism and prejudice.
Let's try to get some callers here. Everybody, the phone number is 214-272-0408. Again, that's 214-272-0408. Let's do a real quick music break and see if we can get some callers in here.
All right, folks, welcome back to the O'Hara News and Editorial. Tonight's guest, Chris Good, is with us, and we do have a caller on the line. Fatherless, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Go ahead and ask your questions.
Well, I have two questions. I guess this is for Chris, but it's really for everybody. It's sort of a story and a question. When I was in high school, we did our domestic violence unit, and one thing that kind of always stood out for me was they talked about how a domestic violence victim, and of course it's always a woman, would have bruises on her forearms, from being held down by a man. And, I never thought much of it, except about a year ago, I was talking to a friend of mine, and she's like a black belt in judo. And I was thinking about what it would actually require to restrain a woman who is trying to hit you without actually hurting her. And the first thing that I imagine most men would do if they were significantly stronger than a woman would be to grab her arms and just hold on to them so she couldn't punch you, And it struck me that that this particular thing was being taught in classrooms where they sort of, slipped it in there, like took something that could be an offensive wound and presented it as strictly a defensive kind of injury.
Wow. That is a very interesting point.
And I guess that was just sort of a thing for you guys to comment on.
That's one of those things where you use the projection of someone simply defending themselves, a stronger person defending themselves from a smaller person who's trying to strike you. What's the most common thing you're going to do? You're going to grab their arms. You're going to keep them from trying to hit you. And oftentimes when you're in a violent altercation, that means you're probably going to bruise that person. What they do is this is defending yourself as violence in that case. And it's we hear when you're talking about domestic violence, quote, education, it is almost entirely dominated by the feminist narrative of patriarchy and all men are violent towards all women, and violence is something that all men hold above all women in order to get their needs met and to control all women. So, if you honestly believe that, it would make sense that you'd use that as this business of, okay, this person's just defending themselves, but we have to turn this into a threat narrative, so we're going to use this mechanism to do that. That's my take on that.
I think that really raises the whole idea of the education that we all get about domestic violence, and that's I don't really believe that we can to try and squabble amongst ourselves, the older generations. We're going to constantly be bringing examples to each other, and I think to address the fact that how we are educated about it, if it's coming from the feminist narrative, we are not addressing the idea that men can be victims. That should at least be said in education, because that's the only way that we can effectively educate for intervention and prevention. So yeah, I think that raises the question of where we may need to direct our efforts in our activism is actually to fix the problem for tomorrow, and that will eventually, I would hope, give future generations the opportunity to change legislation as legislation catches up with cultural understanding and acknowledgement.
So
I think it raises
when you talk about reaching out in education, Chris, when I was talking to my black belt judo friend and talked about the injury on the wrist, she had no problems right away understanding what I was getting at, because she fights, every week with people bigger than her.
Yes.
And I found that a lot of the times, particularly with the issue of violence, women have a much easier time understanding that women can be violent than men can. And I was wondering what your experience was reaching out to people on Huffington Post, where it was a kind of a new crowd to a lot of these issues.
What do you mean in the understanding between whether women would acknowledge that women can be violent.
Two things: women acknowledging that women can be violent, but primarily that to some degree men have this image of women that they just cannot shake. That they really, you could call it pedestalization, but a conception of women that because men build their identities around protecting women.
Yeah.
The idea that a woman is not worthy of protection threatens their identity to the core, so they do everything they can to deny that. And I was wondering, in my experiences, it's easier to talk about this stuff with women, but you've been talking to a different crowd, and I was curious what you experienced over in Huffington Post.
Well, most of the conversations I've had actually are with men who. The people that have really approached me are the men who wanted awareness of this, that they do not have the perception that women are victims and need protection. They need protection from women. And of course, there is this ingrained thing within us, isn't there, within us men, to protect women. So we would all jump to the aid of women. I saw it a couple of months ago in the street, a couple arguing, and I was very ready to intervene if the guy started to physically assault her. I don't know why I didn't intervene when she started to shove him. And of course, yeah, I think more than anything that I encountered in terms of discussions I had were from yes, women acknowledging that, I have actually been violent. If I asked a woman, have they ever been hit by a man? More of them said no to that, and then they would acknowledge but they have hit men themselves and know that their friends would hit men. And so, yeah, there is this knowledge within the women ranks. I think Erin Pitsey, I read something, I'm sure Erin Pitsey actually commented on this, that women know what women are like. In this sense, but they won't admit it to outsiders. It's a quiet knowledge. But more than anything, I think I encountered the relieved victims that were male who were glad that this message was getting out there.
So, do you think that these men that you reached out to, did you get the sense that you might have been the very first person that they had seen talk about this on a major platform?
Definitely on a major platform, yes. In terms of a personal account, the thing about my article was that I was giving a personal account. There are a few, if you dig around enough. I was reading one from April 2013 on the Telegraph website in the UK, and that had some interesting statistics and personal accounts of men, but they are very difficult to find. If you Google domestic violence, you will only find the victimization of women represented, and I think it's as you mentioned, that the picture that greets you is one of the cowering woman or the crying woman sitting on the bed, and so yes, men were very relieved to. Men celebrated, and many women also, that that flip side of the domestic violence issue was represented. Yeah.
Now, did you get the sense that these are people who were, because I imagine kind of two crowds of men who might come to the Huffington Post to talk about these sorts of things. There might be men who have been through certain experiences and are really glad to have an outlet in a more major publication to talk about these things.
Yeah.
And then there's also guys like me who are just sort of like your, I don't know, bread and butter MRAs who are there to, sort of lend support, maybe to a particular perspective, and also maybe to provide, rhetorical support when feminists come in to, come in with their normal talking points,
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what kind of shape did this discussion have? Like, was it, because I find that a lot of times with these conversations, maybe the first hour or the first couple of hours, you get one group of people coming in, and then, by the second or third day, you have an entirely different group of people, and the conversation derails to a totally different place.
Yes.
What was your
right.
sense of how that conversation went, and what kinds of people showed up and when?
Well, of course, I would be curious to. I really wish I could reread all of the comment threads that greeted the Huffington Post crowd brought, but it was full of MRAs that were very willing to reference statistics and provide the rhetoric and the support of the issue. There were the feminists who claimed that who would rather deflect the issue back to women rather than acknowledge that there was a very real problem for men. The thing that I was most moved by was the outcry of victims of finally we're being heard, finally this is being represented. Because if we are all going to reference our experience and know that we have all seen women assault men, well, then all of those men are out there and they're needing to be heard. So that I was very moved by personal messages I got that were just thanking me for saying what I said. Although and everything I've said is not. It's all very. There are decades of statistics and commentary on those statistics. They're just not seen. So yes, there was a celebration of. Many men chose to then tell their stories and say, I can relate to this. I too was assaulted, and nobody did anything when they saw it happen. Nobody asked if I was okay. So what you referenced with regard to domestic violence education was if we see bruises on a woman's wrists, then that's a sign that she might be the victim of abuse. Now, many men out there are probably really hoping, just like I was, that somebody else would intervene if they are powerless to do so, if they're powerless to take action against their loved one. And so, yes, there was there was a sigh of relief breathed through these comment threads. So much so that on my blog, on my All for Equality blog, I put a section on there where men can tell their stories, and just it can be anonymous, and anonymous stories are welcome. But just to write in, just to give them a space to share their experiences, and not only does that hopefully help them because they feel they've communicated that out into the world, and I will push that as much as I can, but also because it's important that it's there in a space that everybody can access, and we have men testifying to how they have been victimized and how they have been powerless. And that, of course, is something which, as a man, I will acknowledge is difficult for men to do. We hold back on doing that, don't we? So the space is there, and I would hope people use it, because the more people put their comments there, the more we can see some quite disturbing accounts of domestic violence against men.
Do I have time for one more question?
I'm fine with anything.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I guess my question then is in regards to when the articles got purged and the conversation got shut down. I've seen articles before where, maybe every once in a while a feminist writer will throw men a bone, and you'll get that a lot of commenters coming in and saying, breathing that sigh of relief. Yes, us too. This happens to us too. Mm. And I find that when feminists allow those discussions to continue, it's because they're able to do those deflections. It's always, well, now you know how we feel.
It's their way of control. It's their way of continuing to control the narrative. It's a way of backpedaling as well as just maintaining control of the narrative. That's my take on it.
And I wanted to ask Chris, do you think that this was shut down because there were so many men coming to breathe a sigh of relief, or it was shut down because there were men coming, or men and women coming to counter the various feminist deflections that were inevitably cropping up.
Well, again, I don't exactly know what the real objection was. I do know that it came from feminists, and from what I can understand from my interaction with feminists is that they have a very strong, that they are trying to push a very specific message. And I think, again, Erin Pitsey would be the one that would comment on the fact that there is money in this, there is power in this. If you own the cause, if you are the victim, then as feminism would make of women, then you are the one that gets all the funding. They lose the entire weight of their argument if they are to acknowledge that men are the victims too. So, in terms of throwing a bone, like you mentioned, on some domestic websites, you will see the picture of the abused woman. You will see that it states that it is for women, and they may throw in there a little statistic that men can be victims too. But the bigger problem is against women. And so, yes, it is throwing a little bone. It's acknowledging what they must acknowledge, but then doing nothing about it. Again, this raises the question of whether they are the true fight for equality. No, if you can acknowledge that people are victims and not do anything about it, then I would question that status.
As of late, I have gotten the sense that there is also, and I say as of late, I mean, like, since we've been having what I believe to be a fair measure of success in challenging the feminist narrative, as far as the public discourse is concerned regarding domestic violence, I get the sense that there is an insurance policy motivation, I guess, if that's a correct way of putting it, where I think they're getting to the point where they know they can't lie to all the people all the time, and so therefore they're kind of saying, okay, but we're going to say, okay, we never really denied this ever. We always did pay lip service to this, when in fact they did not. I think that may have something to do with it. That's maybe, again, that might be the paranoid tinfoil wearing hat conspiracy theorist in my head. But
it's hard to say how intentional people are. You're
sure.
saying so that 10 years from now, when this blows wide open, feminists,
and it will blow wide open. There's no doubt about it.
People can go back. Look, we were on top of this issue 10 years ago. And then,
exactly.
And they have to make sure APFM is buried in the internet searches, so it always looks like a misogynistic hellhole.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. Do you think that the average sort of like, because Chris, James, Robert, like, I mean, there's a lot of money in maintaining this narrative, but do you think there's enough average sort of coffee shop feminists who to come in and feel that strongly? How do I say this? They're going to be motivated. Like, that motivation for the money is only going to motivate a select few, But like, to keep a comment thread deflection effort going, do you think there's enough? What do you think motivates the average coffee shop feminist?
I
think I have an answer to that, but Chris, if you want to go ahead, please go ahead, please.
I've not heard the term coffee shop feminist. I would have to have you tell me. Well, do you mean everyday feminist living her life, adopting
like
feminist values?
A college sophomore who thinks feminism is just about equality. They care about men, blah blah blah, but women do have it a little worse, blah blah blah. That kind of a person who's never heard of Mary Daly, who's never read Andrea Dworkin, that kind of a person.
So what would be her motivation to maintain this narrative? Well, I think that really comes down to the fact that most people go into a cause or into a belief system based on their own personal experience and something that they can relate to. So whether that is just something they've heard a lot. Everybody has seen victimization to some degree, and if they're brought into the belief system that feminism has the answers, it's much like one might regard religion. If this has the answers, and then you adopt everything after that immediate need has been met, and you do so without so much discretion as to what and questioning about the rest of the values. So once I referred to this a little bit in a post on my blog, which is about how we adopt a few core beliefs of something. We believe feminism might be the answer, for example, and then once you say I am a feminist, you adopt everything else that comes with that, and it's part of your identity. And so I think to some degree, you would call it's a cult mentality. I do refer to feminism as a religion, and I think there's a particular mental process that occurs there. Feminism is the answer to one particular need, perhaps, and then it goes from there, that they start to become more active in their opinions, and then they start vlogging, and it all goes from there and escalates. But
I kind of think that the first thing that came to mind when you brought that question up was the term third wave feminism. I think that for the longest time I thought that third wave feminism was just kind of just no more than a rebranding of second wave feminism. Kind of like a new approach to it. But what I've seen with people the likes of Anita Sarkeesian and the whole anti-Gamergate crowd and other people, Amanda Marcotte, there's a whole army of them, really. There's you noted the term coffee shop feminist. There seems to be where it goes beyond just an ideology to the point where it's not, where the ideology doesn't matter. There is a conditioning, a training agenda which says, okay, this is how we maintain the narrative, and it's okay to do this with lies and feeding people misinformation. That's all good because we know we can make money and gain political power in doing this. And that's perfectly okay to do that because we're feminists and that's what we do. That's where I think the whole thing, of course, you have these people that, you could say are, quote, coffee shop feminists that really think that feminists are all about gender equality and this is what we're fighting for and this and that and this and that. But these same people are totally comfortable with shifting their ideas and changing their definitions of equality to suit whatever needs present
But they don't
themselves
even
at the
realize
moment.
it when they do it. They don't even realize it when they do it.
They're trained not to care when it happens. It's all okay.
They're not thinking. Yeah, it's not thinking. They're not thinking from a set of core principles.
It's the ultimate. It's the ultimate application of the idea of the ends justify the means, and that makes everything okay. It makes everything okay. To even someone who may think they're being completely egalitarian or fair. So, once you insert that in people's minds, anything is possible with them, as long as you're defending the ideology. That's what comes. That's what comes to mind with me. I mean, does that, James? Actually, I'd like to hear your opinion on this.
Oh no, it's okay. Go ahead.
Father's just brought up core principles, and you and I have talked a lot about this this business of ideology being the justification for any kind of means necessary in order to support said ideology. It's I think that feminism, the question was that Father said, at what point does the average coffee shop feminist get to the point where they take the red pill, so to speak? Well, they never will, because once you instill this idea that everything is okay as long as you're supporting this ideology, because the ideology is unassailable. Anything is possible. You can do
Well, it's
anything.
like a computer program that can only reference one line back. You know,
Right.
instead of running through all the principles from the very beginning every single time through the argument, they only go back 2 or 3 lines and just forget all the shit they were saying 5 minutes ago.
Exactly. Yes.
You know,
And that seems to be
Chris,
when I say third wave feminism, that seems to be what the intellectual habits I see going on with whereas even second wave feminism, sure, they were crazy, they were whacked out, but well, of course they're doing the same thing we're talking about here, but at the same time it was a definable ideology. They had this idea of the patriarchy theory and stuff like that. They went beyond more than 2 lines back, so to speak, as you just said. But with this third wave thing, it's incredibly shallow, which gives them tremendous freedom. That's just how I see it. And maybe I'm not making complete sense, but
no, that makes sense. I mean, second wave feminism doesn't seem to make much effort to hide its, virulent hatred for men. And it just follows that those principles, warped as they are, through their logical conclusion, leading to the, destruction of of half of humanity. And maybe you're right. I mean, maybe third wave feminism is beginning to carry that out, which is only possible if you don't realize that that's what you're actually doing. So you have to kind of keep forgetting what you said 5 minutes ago.
Right. And it's okay to forget what you said 5 minutes ago, because as long as you're defending the ideology, as long as at any particular minute your ideology comes out on top. But that can only happen sometimes as long as you forget 5 minutes prior.
That's what an ideologue does. They pick first they pick their side, and then they pick their principles.
Right. Yes.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Chris, where do you want to see these conversations go? Over the coming years. How do you want to see? How do you want to get more people aware of these kinds of issues and talking about them? Because us MRAs can talk to each other forever. Who cares?
Well,
but you reached a whole bunch of new people. So.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's something that I addressed in one of my blog posts, which A Voice for Men put onto their site, and it's that I kept sitting down and thinking what was the next article I would write, and the fact is that it has all been written about before, and by much greater researchers and writers, and so. Yeah, where can this go? If to squabble on comment threads and take the fight back to the feminists that are commenting there, I think that's important. But I think there's something else that we need to do, and that's not to focus so much on the anti-feminism, but we do not need the permission of feminists to start acting on the statistics and acting for the causes and the victims that we know are there, and the way I sort of picture it is that we can try and tear down their steeples, or we can leave them to it. Unfortunately, I've started to understand that they are here to stay, that they're much too powerful. They are a Goliath, but instead of throwing our pebbles at that constantly, we perhaps need to start. Moving forward in how we can provide support and become active in changing the lives of the men that are victims. So, I don't know. I think I would like to pull away a touch from the anti-feminism, although that does need to be continually confronted, and to instead start to address the issues and act on behalf of the issues and the victims. So, for example, a point I keep making is that anti-feminism is not newsworthy, it wouldn't seem, and neither is it going to get us published in mainstream media. What if, on the other hand, some very significant causes, charities, and there are some already, and movements started to happen that is newsworthy. I fully believe that a community that is exposed to many posters for a support group for male victims of domestic violence, if the community grew used to seeing that the posters are there, they're going to start getting used to the idea that the problem exists, and that is perhaps a way to sidestep the censorship that we see in the media. What if we just start acting on what we know? I do compare this to, I was a Christian for 10 years. I no longer am, but I studied the old the movements in the church, and the Catholic Church became so strong, and the Protestant Church was down in the ditches. And I compare this to feminism and the men's rights movements. And the Protestants couldn't bring down the Catholic Church, but they grew in their own right and are now of equal stature. Maybe we can start to put our efforts into just becoming strong in our own selves. I don't know if I entirely made sense there, but
no, it
I
sounds
hope
like
you
you're
get what I
talking
mean.
about building parallel institutions.
Yeah, you're exactly. Well, that was perfect. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for example, the change in my thinking is that my first article on the Huffington Post, which you can now read on Thought Catalogue, was entitled "Why Feminism Needs to End. It's Time to Work Towards Equality." The last article that was published on A Voice for Men is titled "Let Feminists Enjoy Their Ivory Towers, and We'll Get On with Creating the Change," or something like that. And I think I've come to realize that feminism is here to stay. It's very powerful, but how can we instead begin to work around that and that parallel institution, build that up?
Well, Chris, I'll make a statement, and maybe you can comment on that.
Actually, gentlemen, I must say we need to end the show pretty soon. Yeah, but that's okay. But please go ahead and ask your question, and we'll see if we can wrap it up after that. But I just want to let you know that we're going to have to make this
sure thing. There's something to be said for like edging off the anti-feminism a little bit and focusing on building parallel institutions. But two functions of anti-feminism that I think are very helpful are, one, recruitment, because you can pull a lot of potential MRAs or whatever, pro-male people who are very disaffected from feminist literature but keep going to it because they think it's only people talking about gender issues.
Yes.
And two, maybe the more important part of anti-feminism theory as you go forward with parallel institutions is to build a shell, to build a rhetorical shell so that those institutions can't be co-opted 10, 20 years from now.
I hope I'm not misunderstood. I think that the opposition to feminism needs to continue. I think that is very, very necessary because yes, it provides that immediate alternative viewpoint and it shows that there is something to challenge it. My point is that we cannot direct all of our efforts there. But I do agree with you. On my last article for Thought Catalogue, I acknowledge the point that we need to continue the anti-feminist stance, but I just don't want to be 30 years older and see ourselves very much where we are now. I would like to somehow gain the strength that I can see in the men's rights movement and support these very struggling charities. For example, I can't remember what it's called now, but the men's rights domestic violence charity that for example in the UK. Just keep writing stories about that, helping them create newsworthy events, and eventually I think we'll see a cultural change. We may be the unsung heroes in 40 years, but I think we can make change. It won't be by seeing the ivory tower of feminists burn down or anything. But I do agree with your point.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to have to call it now. Fatherless, thanks so much for calling in. You called in before. You're a great caller. I wish we had more callers. That's okay, though. We do have a limited amount of time. We did cover an awful lot of ground in the past 2 hours. Chris, thank you so much for calling in. I hope maybe sometime to have you as a guest again at some point in the future. You're a great guest, and you have a lot of very interesting things to say.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. James, it's been a wonderful show tonight. Do we have any final advice for our listeners?
Absolutely. Take the red pill.